In the immortal words of the real Slim Shady, guess who's back with a brand new yap? Because Warhammer the Old World just announced more models for the Grand Cathay faction, and your girl is ever prepared to serve fresh takes. When the first Cathay models were released back in April, I made a little video examining their design choices through the lens of real Chinese culture and history. If you haven't seen that analysis yet, I recommend that you go back and watch that first so you have a better background on details we've already discussed before we dive into part 2, Great Bastard Boogaloo. But to restate my approach for the fresh faces who are determined to have a context-free viewing experience, Grand Cathay is largely based on Chinese culture of the late Middle Ages, and its visual design clearly evokes that inspiration. Now let's be clear, I am under no illusion that a Warhammer setting is a literal one-to-one representation of medieval China. My goal in comparing the models to historical source material is not to enact some sort of purity test of accuracy upon fantasy, rather it is my firm position that in settings so clearly based on real culture, thoughtfully integrating real details from said culture imbues these fictional settings with greater depth, authenticity, and naturalism. So let's once again investigate how fantasy can be enriched by history, and ask ourselves, when does a fantastical departure add thematic or visual impact? And when is it just sort of 没意思? If you're ready for more, let's get into it.
This great bastion has stood for 3,000 years. It shall not fall today.
I'm just going to start at the top of the Warhammer community post and work my way on down. So let's begin with a look at Cathay's new mage units, the Astromancers of the Celestial Court. At first glance, these figures might seem purely fantastical with their long flowing robes and lavish ornamentation, but there's actually a lot of interesting cultural symbolism here. Let's talk about these pairs of big long feathers. These are very reminiscent of a real element of Chinese opera costume called Lingzi or Zhiling, which are two long pheasant feathers suspended from crowns or helmets. Because pheasants are known to be very combative creatures, the Lingzi are typically used to connote handsome military commanders or other characters of great martial prowess. You might recognize them from many modern depictions of the legendary hero Lü Bu from Romance of the Three Kingdoms. There is some evidence of Lingzi in historical artwork dating back to the Han Dynasty, and we know from written sources that there was actually a real military headdress called the pheasant's tail cap. So it is possible that they were actually used on the battlefield in some fashion. However, we see them most commonly depicted in illustrations starting in the Qing Dynasty, so it is likely that over time they became mostly visual signifiers of legendary status, much like the symbolic mountain armor. Speaking of, I'm a little bummed that mountain armor wasn't used in the design of their thigh defenses. As discussed in my first Cathay commentary, this particular pattern is most often associated with mythical entities, so I think it would have been pretty appropriate here to reflect the Astromancer's magical abilities. Now, I talked a bit about Chinese horse armor in the last video, so I'm not going to go too in-depth here, but I will say I am unreasonably irritated by the styling of this horse's mane. It's giving European dressage in a way that feels very out of place to me. I have never seen a historical depiction of a Chinese warhorse with a braided or plaited mane. Now, having meticulously cataloged every single historical source across 3,500 years of Chinese recorded history in order to conclusively say that it never happened ever? 当然没有. But I have seen a fair few Chinese horses in my time across relief, painting, and sculpture, and it hasn't really shown up. Mostly we see either a long natural mane or this short central ridge, which might suggest that the mane was cut like these modern Mongolian horses, for example. To get these sorts of shapes for visual interest, you could just add ornaments to the bard itself. Like the Jade Lancers and Gate Masters look great. That is a perfect solution to achieve the desired silhouette without the unnerving impression of four little dudes inside a horse suit. But moving on from the stuff of nightmares, this particular martial arts pose with the second and third fingers extended is probably very familiar because it appears everywhere in pop culture. But it does actually have a real basis in wushu and taiji chuan forms, particularly in the sword arts. They're in fact called sword fingers by modern practitioners, and there are many potential explanations for the gesture's purpose. It could serve as a counterweight to the sword to balance the posture, to direct energy, or to aid in flow and continuity between movements. All of those potential origins perfectly support the Astromancer's lore. It makes total sense to me to design these units with a gesture that could help channel and focus magical energy. And speaking of magic, let's talk about their little corvid buddies. To tell you true, I think this unit is a little bit of a weird outlier for this faction because while crows exist in China, they just aren't a super culturally significant animal. Before you furiously prompt ChatGPT to argue with me, hold on, let me get to the point. In Warhammer lore, the Onyx Crowmen are agents of the Moon Empress, gathering information across the Empire so that she might advise the Emperor. This spying crow trope is straight out of Norse mythology, where Odin's ravens, Hugin and Munin, are similarly charged with collecting and reporting information. There's no comparable spy or messenger association with crows in Chinese culture, though much as in Europe, they have a sinister reputation as harbingers of misfortune. However, in some versions of ancient Chinese mythology, crows have a more majestic role. One of the most well-known Chinese creation myths tells of how the world used to have 10 suns, which would take turns appearing in the sky each day. In some older versions of the myth, each of the 10 suns was inhabited by a three-legged crow. One day, the 10 suns appeared in the sky at once, quickly scorching the earth. So the heroic archer Hou Yi shot all but one of the suns out of the sky in order to save all living things. In some versions of the story, Hou Yi is gifted an immortality potion by the gods as a reward, which is stolen by one of his apprentices, and then stolen back by Hou Yi's wife, Chang'e, in order to keep it out of unscrupulous hands. She then flies to the moon to escape. In other versions, after saving the world, Hou Yi is crowned Hero King, but quickly proves a cruel and tyrannical ruler. After he is gifted the potion of immortality, Chang'e once again steals the potion and flees to the moon to prevent her ruthless husband from subjugating his people for eternity. To this day, Chang'e continues to be honored during the Chinese Mid-Autumn Festival. The Chinese Lunar Exploration Program is named after her, and her character probably also inspires Warhammer's Moon Empress as well. All that said, crows just don't feel super culturally appropriate to be the agents of the Moon Empress. But you know what would be? Bunnies. Because in Chinese mythology, the jade rabbit Yu Tu lives on the moon with Chang'e, using a mortal and pestle to continue to make the immortality elixir for her. How amazing would it be if the Astromancers summoned jade rabbit men instead? I'm just saying. Runner-up suggestion, bats are actually good luck in Chinese culture because tonal languages love a good pun, and the word for bat has the same sound as the word for good fortune. Fool. As creatures of the night, bats also have proximity to the moon. So I hereby submit my rank choice ballot for bunnies and bats the next time they consider a new familiar for this set. Let's see if there's anything else I want to touch on here. Okay, I get that big honkin' pauldrons are a Warhammer staple, but I wish they had considered a slightly more East Asian shape, where shoulder protection is typically a single rectangular flap that wraps around the upper arm. Not this triangular pointy thing that protrudes over the shoulders. Maybe it's trying to evoke our sort of modern idea of magician costume a la Jafar from Disney's Aladdin. Or maybe it's unconsciously inspired by Japanese kateginu of the Edo period. But I hope not, because mixing up Chinese and Japanese culture is just not a super great look in general, but especially ill-advised when Nippon is already a setting in the old world. Save some of those design ideas for later. For this next section, I'm going to lump together the Crane Gun team and Iron Hail Gunners, because the main thing we have to discuss here is guns. To be perfectly honest, I am not at all interested in interrogating these guns for historical accuracy. I mean, they have long-range sniper rifles, when guns weren't even meaningfully accurate until way after the Ming Dynasty. It's whatever, man. Enjoy the rule of cool. The shields that they're anchored on are worth noting, though. During the Ming Dynasty, the Chinese did deploy large freestanding shields like the Li Pai, Ai Pai, or Ding Pai, all of which were roughly similar to their European pavis. I don't know of any tactical formation that required a separate handler for the shield, but that's fine. It's one of those fantasy departures that's actually kind of neat, because it speaks to the tight cooperation of Cathay's forces. Now, Chinese shields were often lavishly painted with intimidating images like tigers to scare enemy horses. So all you mini painters out there, I'm expecting greatness from you. You need to be flexing that creativity. Armor-wise, we're seeing the same brigandine-ish garments shared by the artillery units of the first release, and the same Ming Dynasty-inspired laminar arm harness shared by the Jade Warriors and Lancers. Points for a unified design language, though personally, if I were outfitting an army, I would give them helmets, first and foremost. One historical tactics note, just for fun, please don't use this on the table and then blame me later. In the Ming Dynasty, there were a few standard fire disciplines for arquebusiers. 3 rotating ranks where the first line fires, then the second, then the third. 5 rotating ranks, a 5-rank salvo where everyone fired at once and then reloaded at once, and a reload assistant method, where on a squad of 5 dudes, you only had 1 designated gunner, but 4 assistants and 5 matchlock guns. So basically your gunner would fire, he would pass it back to Assistant 1, who would give him a freshly loaded gun, shoot that, pass it back to get a fresh gun from Assistant 2, and so on and so on. This method actually enjoyed greater efficiency and accuracy because the gunner only had to focus on shooting rather than reloading. But it was inherently more fragile because as soon as you lost your gunner, the whole team was reduced to useless scrubs. Speaking of scrubs, it's peasant time! Finally, we're getting some archers. Archery was a core skill in Chinese high culture for thousands of years. Starting in the Zhou Dynasty, which spanned 1122 to 256 BCE, Chinese education was centered around 6 noble arts: math, calligraphy, music, ceremony, horsemanship, and archery. While firearms began to be widely adopted in the Ming Dynasty between the 14th and 17th centuries, early gunpowder weapons were so slow and inaccurate that bows remained an integral part of Imperial China's military composition for several hundred more years. In fact, archery was only removed from the military exam syllabus in 1901. So I love to see me some archer representation in Cathay. I'm only bummed that there isn't more of it. And you know what would have been a really cool detail to include? While there is certainly no singular style of Chinese archery, given the empire's huge geography and ancient history that necessarily resulted in incredible diversity, one of the most notable techniques that distinguishes many of its variants is the thumb draw, which, to be fair, was shared by many other continental Asian cultures, but notably not the Japanese. Now, it looks like our Cathayan peasants here are using the 3-finger draw, or Mediterranean draw, that we see in many European cultures. Which isn't wrong. To be clear, during some periods such as the Zhou Dynasty, the 3-finger draw was also used in China. It just could have been really neat to further differentiate Cathay with a signature technique. While we're talking about weapons, I'd like to point out this uniquely crescent-shaped thing here, which is a cool reference to a real Chinese polearm called the chan. It's basically a big ol' axe that you thrust with rather than slice with. This concave version was called the Yueya chan, while the convex version was the Tianpeng chan. The modern martial arts versions of the chan have an extra spade head at the opposite end, but historically they mostly had a butt spike. The Warhammer version appears to just have a flat butt, but that's no shade. On this channel, we celebrate weapons of all shapes and sizes. Now, the last thing I'll touch on before we go is hair. Historically, Han Chinese people did not cut their hair out of the Confucian principle of filial piety. The thinking goes that since your hair and skin are inherited from your parents, it would be tremendously disrespectful to damage those gifts. So traditional Han hairstyles were endlessly creative in the ways they wound or tied up their hair. All the hair on display here is quite appropriate, and in fact these top knots look particularly Qing Dynasty inspired. However, I will say that these long flowing ponytails are a little bit out of place. You see this style in historical fantasy dramas a lot, like its signature medieval fantasy magical hottie hair, so not super befitting a Peasant Levy. I much prefer the other hats and hair coverings shown here, not only because they have historical precedent, but they are much more appropriate to represent someone from the working class, where you would want to protect your face from the sun and your hair from the daily grit and grime of your work. Overall, I still love this set, and I don't mind repeating myself on that point. The artists have made some really smart decisions to add meaning to their design by strategically drawing from real culture. And I think each new release adds some interesting depth not only to the gameplay of Grand Cathay as a faction, but to the culture of Grand Cathay as a fictional setting. Also, love to see iteration here, like the fact that the Emperor now has 5 fingies in the new trailer where he only had 4 in the first. 非常好. As always, thanks so much for watching. I make video essays about history, fashion, and design, with particular emphasis on armor and material culture of the late Middle Ages. So if that sounds like a good time to you, I hope you'll like and subscribe for more, and consider supporting my work on Ko-fi. Until next time, stay shiny.